He didn't leave in anger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the door on his way out. He just stopped showing up. Not suddenly. Not loudly. Not with a grand announcement. He stopped replying first. Stopped explaining things that no one really listened to. Stopped trying to matter to people who never made space for him. Not because he didn't care, but because he started seeing the truth beneath the noise. He realized that his presence had become invisible. His effort, expected. His patience, mistaken for indifference. His silence, taken as compliance. While others filled their days with distractions and noise, he found something else, a quiet that didn't demand anything from him. While they chased attention and approval, he began chasing something deeper, discipline, focus, clarity. He didn't vanish to be dramatic. He vanished to survive. Because sometimes, the most dangerous kind of pain is the one you carry quietly, the one that never screams, the kind that slowly erodes your sense of self until you're still there physically, but long gone emotionally. He wasn't running away from people. He was returning to himself. And if you ever wonder why a man like him disappears, look closer. A man doesn't just walk away overnight. His quiet exit is rarely impulsive. It's the end of 1,000 silent sacrifices, stacked over years, unnoticed, unreciprocated, unspoken. What you see as distance is often just the final step in a journey of being ignored. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't dramatic. He was steady. The kind of presence you could count on, even when no one else showed up. He carried the weight others avoided. Quietly, without complaint, at work, he was the one who stayed late, making sure the details no one noticed were taken care of. At home, he was the one who kept the roof from leaking, the bills from piling up, the chaos from spilling over. He gave time, energy, patience, sometimes more than he actually had to spare. And because he rarely asked for anything in return, people assumed he didn't need much. They called it strength. They called it loyalty. They said he was dependable, and he was. But behind those labels was a slow, unraveling, piece by piece. His own desires slipped further away. He stopped asking what he wanted for dinner. He stopped choosing what movie to watch. He stopped remembering what it felt like to do something purely for himself. The mirror still showed a man, but the edges of who he used to be were fading. The truth is, when a man gives endlessly without being seen, without being valued, it doesn't just drain him, it erases him. It's not sudden. It's gradual, so subtle that one day he looks at his own reflection and realizes he doesn't recognize the man staring back. And when a man gives without being seen, there comes a day when even his own reflection doesn't recognize him anymore. He didn't break with noise. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no public collapse. He broke quietly. In the kinds of ways people overlook, he skipped the dinner invitation, telling himself he was just tired. He didn't return the phone call, promising he'd get to it tomorrow. He stayed home more, letting the days blur together, and the world went on without noticing. And that was the part that cut the deepest, not the distance he created, not the absence he left behind, but how easily others seemed to adjust. No questions, no concern, just a quiet acceptance of his withdrawal, as though he were never needed in the first place. The loneliness wasn't loud, it was suffocating in its silence. He thought about all the times he had been there for others, the times he carried their burdens, their secrets, their fears. And now, when he pulled away, the space he left behind barely made a ripple. That realization hollowed him more than any argument or betrayal ever could. It confirmed the fear he had tried so long to suppress, that he could disappear, and life for everyone else would continue unchanged. Yet in that silence, something unexpected stirred. It wasn't the echo of other people's voices, or the absence of their attention. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, faint at first, but undeniable. A voice not from the world outside, but from within himself. At first, The stillness felt like punishment. The absence of constant activity, the silence where conversations used to be, pressed against him like a weight. It felt like failure, as if slowing down meant he had lost the momentum that once defined him. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the quiet began to change shape. The noise of obligations, expectations, and endless giving started to fade, and with that fading came relief. Mornings no longer began in a rush. They stretched, unhurried. The taste of coffee, once swallowed in haste, became something he noticed rich, steady, grounding. He walked through his home and felt the calm in its walls. A calm that wasn't emptiness but space. In that space, his thoughts began to surface, no longer frantic, no longer sharp with self-criticism. They softened. They became clearer. Stillness, he realized, hadn't destroyed him. It was slowly piecing him back together, without the constant pull of others, without the pressure to perform. He found pieces of himself he thought were gone. Curiosity, patience, even joy in the simplest details. What once felt like exile began to feel like sanctuary, and from that new stillness, he began rewriting the rules of how he lived and who had access to him. He doesn't chase anymore. He doesn't stretch himself thin to prove his worth, and he no longer explains his choices to those who only half listen. The need to beg for attention, for recognition, has vanished. His time is now guarded like a treasure, parceled out with intention. His boundaries are not negotiable. They are the quiet walls that protect his sanity. And his energy, once poured out freely, often recklessly, is now treated as priceless. The rules are simple. If something drains him, it doesn't deserve his presence. If something confuses him, he pauses and questions it, rather than rushing forward blindly. And if something costs him his peace, it is, without question, far too expensive to afford. Each decision is measured against this new code, and for the first time, he feels he is living by principles rather than by default. This way of living didn't come overnight. It was carved from experience, from the pain of giving too much and the emptiness of being overlooked. But once in place, it became a compass, steady, unwavering. The world hasn't changed, but his response to it has, and in that response, he's found a freedom that feels non-negotiable. But it wasn't just what he let go of. It was what he began to see more clearly, especially about the people around him. They don't know what to do with him anymore. The man who once bent, once yielded, once absorbed the weight of everyone else's expectations, is no longer the same. Now he is unreadable. He doesn't flinch at disapproval. He doesn't scramble to fix what others break. He doesn't respond to manipulation with guilt or urgency. His calm unsettles them because it cannot be controlled. He is unbothered, no longer tethered to approval or applause. Where he once sought belonging, he now chooses solitude. If the alternative demands his silence or submission, he is unattached, not because he is incapable of love, but because his worth is no longer tied to whether or not he is chosen. He has stepped outside the game entirely, the game of proving, pleasing, and apologizing for existing. And that terrifies the people who once thrived on his compliance. Those who depended on his sacrifices now see him as distant. Those who once leaned on his endless giving now find themselves exposed. His refusal to play by the old rules is disruptive, not because he is cruel, but because he no longer needs validation to stand tall. He has learned the power of restraint, of silence, of walking away when the cost is too high. But strength like this doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from surviving and choosing, every single day, to remain whole. They call him alone, but he calls it aligned. What others mistake for emptiness is, in truth, a carefully chosen space. His home is quiet, not because it lacks voices, but because it no longer carries arguments, demands, or obligations that drain him. His phone doesn't buzz endlessly, but the silence is not loneliness, it is freedom. In that quiet, he finds his mind calm, uncluttered, steady. He doesn't need company to feel valuable. He no longer measures his worth by who calls, who texts, or who remembers him on holidays. His value is written in the way he shows up for himself, the way he honors his own time, the way he respects the energy it takes to simply live with intention. What he seeks is not noise, not performance, but presence, real, genuine presence. There is a strength in this peace, a strength that unsettles those who cannot imagine being whole without someone else to validate them. But for him, peace is not an accident. It is a practice, a daily decision to choose clarity over chaos, alignment over approval. And if love ever returns, it will have to meet him inside the calm, not drag him back into the storm he fought so hard to leave behind. He's not angry. He's not hiding. He has simply reached the point where he is done losing himself just to be loved. He no longer sees sacrifice as proof of devotion, nor silence as the price of belonging. He doesn't reject connection, but he will only accept one that is honest, peaceful, and truly mutual. Anything less feels like stepping backward into a life he no longer fits. He moves differently now. His pace is slower, deliberate, but each step carries more weight, more certainty. He speaks less, but when he does, his words cut deeper because they come from a place of clarity rather than desperation. His presence no longer bends to fill gaps in other people's lives. Instead, it stands firm, rooted in his own. To some, he may appear alone, but what they don't see is that this time, he is not lost. He has walked through the noise, the giving, the breaking, the silence, and emerged with a map written in his own hand. He knows the cost of disappearing, and he refuses to pay it again. He gave too much once. He vanished once. But now, he is here present, steady, whole, for the only person who never walked away, himself. If you've ever felt the silence rebuild you, leave a comment. Peace found me when I stopped performing. Here's in second.